Hi, everybody, and welcome to week 4, which is over chapter 21 and the High Renaissance Art of Italy. And this is part 1 of this week's lecture. The Cinquecento. In the Quattrocento, or the 1400s, we saw the initiation of Renaissance ideals, especially in the art of Italy. Characteristics of early Renaissance art, that is, references to antiquity, nude figures, linear perspective, and humanism, will continue in the Cinquecento, or the 1500s, through the period known as the High or Classical Renaissance. The High Renaissance is a time period of roughly 40 years, dating to 1490 to 1530. This period style was created by art historians in order to define what they perceived as a classicism, a height of perfection in Renaissance art during this era. High Renaissance as an art historical period is marked by the names of artists who continue to be household names in the Western world today, almost 500 years after their careers have ended. This 40-year period is held in such high esteem by Western artists, art historians, and appreciators of art that it is the subject of thousands of books, and though it is a minute slice of time, it commands its own college-level art history courses. The term High Renaissance clearly conveys a sense of evolution of art from adequate to excellent. It also conveys a sense of superiority and of the aforementioned classicism or perfection of art during this period. Indeed, although the High Renaissance is perceived to be the culmination of events of the early Renaissance, the subject of last week's module, it's also generally considered to be above and beyond the Quattrocento in terms of artistic achievement, historical glory, and effect on future art movements. It is important for you to understand these widely held perceptions about the superiority of High Renaissance art and artists, even as we seek in this course to bring them down to earth and give them context. The reasons this is important are manyfold, but here are 3 that are especially pertinent. First and foremost, it should be important to you as a student to critically assess and attempt to question and even debunk assumptions that you are asked to make about history. This is true whether the assumption is that women did not make art because we didn't know their names, that because ancient Egyptian art depicts death rituals they must have been obsessed with death, or that the High Renaissance was a nearly divine period of unparalleled artistic achievement, before or since. Secondly, it's important to understand this perception of High Renaissance art and artists because it was being cultivated even at that time by artists, art appreciators, and art historians, which at the end of the Renaissance was a new profession. Imagine having an idea in your mind, reinforced by society, that your own period of time was the height of a sort of evolution of artistic achievement. Now you, as an artist, will feel motivated by this knowledge to achieve greatness as defined by your colleagues and by philosophers and scholars of the day. Surely this idea has a profound effect on the nature of art produced by High Renaissance artists. Thirdly, the perception of High Renaissance art does have an effect on later artistic periods. We will notice that artists often either hearken back to or break away from High Renaissance ideals throughout art history, even up to today, as they too feel the effect of the canonization of High Renaissance as the epitome of Western art. In Module 3, or Week 3, we learned that artists who were in demand during the early Renaissance began to enjoy the higher social status afforded to educated scholars. Artists like Lorenzo Ghiberti and Filippo Brunelleschi were perceived to be what we call today Renaissance people. They were special individuals who could work in virtually any medium of their choice, including writing and philosophy. In the High Renaissance, the elevation of art and the artist continued and accelerated. Sought-after artists were considered geniuses. The development of the printing press allowed for the dissemination of artists' work, which could lead to international fame. And suddenly, one did not need to actually travel to Florence or Rome in order to see a famous artist's work. Art itself was elevated to the status of liberal arts like mathematics, language, and philosophy, which were considered highly intellectual and difficult to access. Where before artists rarely created commentaries and essays on their ideas and work, this was actually expected of the High Renaissance artist, who should ideally also be a learned philosopher and writer. The numerous surviving letters, diaries, notebooks, and aggrandizing biographies like Vasari's Lives of the Most Excellent Artists attest to the self-conscious nature of being a Renaissance artist. The very survival of such documents, like Leonardo da Vinci's left-handed sketchbooks, indicate a historical self-consciousness. Previously, it would have been unheard of to suggest that an artist or his or her estate keep and preserve notes for public consumption after the artist's death. It also becomes clear from the tone of many letters, notebooks, and diaries that high Renaissance artists understood they would be read by a larger audience. Perhaps they even understood or hoped that people like us would be reading their private ideas centuries later. Their documents also seem to indicate they understood that they were expected to create works for which we would remember them. Again, the notion of lasting fame of artists, who were previously thought of as vocational or manual laborers, is a novel idea in the Renaissance. The Book of the Courtier by Baldassare Castiglione, you can see a portrait of on the screen, provided a sort of guidebook for the comportment, behavior, and education of the Renaissance gentleman, and artists were expected to conform to these social expectations. Published in 1527, it was well known in its draft form during the High Renaissance. Taking their tone from the early Renaissance works of Leon Battista Alberti, like De Pittura or On Painting, Renaissance artists, patrons, and scholars reinforced a new hierarchy of art forms. Alberti had characterized painting as a scholarly and philosophical undertaking that involved mathematics, geometry, and the study of nature. However, Alberti recommended that artists seek not just to imitate, but to improve upon nature, a theme that will remain important during the High Renaissance. De Pictura also functioned as a sort of early predecessor to Vasari's Lives of the Artists. Alberti's treatises and other artists' responses to them had the effect of elevating some art forms, especially painting and architecture, but also sculpture, to important scholarly and divine undertakings, while others were not so elevated. This could be described as a hierarchy of art forms. It is a sort of imposed social order over art forms that will remain influential into the 20th century. Of course, these fine philosophical shifts in how the educated and important classes thought about art and the artists had real consequences for high Renaissance people. In practice, the social redefinition of art and the artist actually restricted the definition of important art to painting, sculpture, and architecture. This left many art domains accessible to underprivileged artists out of the definition of great art. Fiber art forms and manuscript illumination, both of which were either dominated by or equally shared by women, were once considered highly important. Now the definition of great art, according to the High Renaissance scholars, excluded them, although these lower order art forms and oil painters often used very similar, sometimes identical, principles to govern their work. Ironically, in this age of humanism, with the rise in social status of certain artists, came the restriction of the category of great artist. Art was now created mostly outside of the walls of the convents and monasteries, where the largely anonymous practice of art had taken place for centuries in Europe. Persistent, institutionalized, and ingrained sexism meant that only men were believed to have the intellectual and moral capacity to undertake the newly redefined art. Women were actively discouraged from practicing art and summarily rejected from the art world. Very few women had the opportunity to pursue large and important commissions during the Renaissance. However, wealthy women, such as Isabella d'Este, who you're seeing on the screen, were very often art patrons. Castiglione's Book of the Courtier did not dismiss women's capacity for art and society outright. In fact, women of high stature figure as characters in the book. However, the proper behavior of women is treated as a separate section. Also, Castiglione confirms what you have probably already guessed, that people who were highborn or of privileged families were considered naturally better suited to high-class and important activities like art making. Florence and Rome. As in the early Renaissance, High Renaissance Florence was a major center for private artistic commissions from wealthy patrons. Despite humanism's de-emphasis of religion, however, papal and other religious commissions were still very profitable. Although high Renaissance artists of Florence were conscious of the unique tenor of their time, they still looked to late Gothic and early Renaissance artists for inspiration. Quattrocento artists like Masaccio, Brunelleschi, and Donatello, who we studied last week, were revered for their achievements in what was perceived to be an evolution of style, of course moving toward perfection. There are many, many high Renaissance artists we could discuss. Dozens of artists were active and successful at any given time. However, as we look back at this short period, several artists stand out because of the fame they gained during their lifetimes, as well as the overwhelming popularity and influence of their works during the ensuing centuries. These are also the reasons your textbook author chose to focus on them. I'm not trying to tell you that these artists are the greatest. Indeed, there are many other high Renaissance artists whose works are fascinating, beautiful, and highly influential during their own time. Yet when we think of this highly idealized and romanticized period, these three artists in particular rise immediately to mind: Leonardo, Raphael, and Michelangelo. Their lives and works, though great, are also romanticized by society and art history. Many legends about these artists exist, and you can read some of them in Vasari's Lives. So what follows is a discussion of some of their works, the major commissions for which they were known, and that which makes them different from one another. Leonardo da Vinci. Like most Italian Renaissance-era artists, da Vinci was widely known by a single name. Italians didn't always use patronymics, and were often called by a nickname or after their place of origin. Leonardo was from the town of Vinci, hence Da Vinci. Today, Leonardo is often called the Old Man of the Renaissance, as he was already a mature and established artist by the time the High Renaissance began. Leonardo started out as a student for the well-known Florentine artist Verrocchio, who you may remember as the sculptor of the Doubting Thomas of Orsan Michele. Leonardo soon moved to Milan and was court painter to Ludovico Sforza and Beatrice d'Este. It was under their patronage that he created one of the most reproduced images in art history, the Last Supper fresco. As with his other ventures in life, he worked frequently as an inventor and military advisor. Da Vinci was an experimental artist. When he designed the Last Supper for the refectory or cafeteria in the monastery of Santa Maria delle Grazie, he experimented on two fronts: the space of the composition and the makeup of the paint medium. In one, he was very successful, but in the other, the result was a complete failure. Leonardo handled the space of the Last Supper in an innovative way. Unlike previous Last Suppers by other artists, the Milan Last Supper has all of the figures on one side of the table. The table is pushed to the front of the picture plane so that it is right in front of us, which must have given something of a sense of being there to the monks. The background is empty, perfect one-point linear perspectival space, cleanly rendered with little to get in the way. In the back, three openings in the wall symbolize the Holy Trinity, and the arch formed by the center window forms a half halo over the head of Christ. This composition, which seems so simple and elegant, was fairly revolutionary, so much so that it was copied by other artists, even contemporaries. Yet to us, the Last Supper may seem humdrum because we have seen hundreds of cheap copies. In fact, today this composition is considered to be the standard manner of displaying the subject. No doubt the composition was a huge success. The failure of this artwork was its medium. Leonardo did not use traditional fresco, as we might expect. Instead, he experimented with a mix of tempera and oil on top of plaster. As you might guess, the result was terrible, and the painting was falling apart and growing mold within a few years. You can read more about the fate of the Last Supper on page 637 of your textbook. Probably one of Leonardo's most famous works is his Mona Lisa. This is also known as La Gioconda. The portrait, though well known, may seem unassuming at first. But like the Last Supper, the Mona Lisa is also experimental in its illusionary mass and other details. Leonardo developed a technique called sfumato, meaning smoky, that forms a more delicate chiaroscuro, with barely perceptible changes between shades of light and dark. This is especially effective on the portrait sitter's skin. Sfumato combines traditional illusionary mask techniques of chiaroscuro with transparent glazes of smoky-colored oil paint. This portrait is also unusual in that it is a three-quarter view, a format that Leonardo popularized. It also has a triangular format that Leonardo used for other paintings, such as the Madonna of the Rocks. As evidenced by his experiments in space and paint, Leonardo was very interested in science. He was especially interested, as many artists were, in rendering accurate human anatomy. But most artists didn't go as far as Leonardo did in order to achieve correct, perfect anatomy. Leonardo had cadavers brought to him under cover of darkness so that he could dissect them and draw their muscles, tendons, bones, and all. He even dissected a woman who had died while very pregnant, as evidenced by his sketches. Many of the ideas Leonardo left behind were somewhat underdeveloped, to say the least, and we would do his memory a disservice by painting him as some sort of objective scientist. Yet he was certainly ahead of his time. While his experiments with cadavers were illegal and frowned upon by society at first, they were so fruitful to the understanding of human anatomy that the studying of cadavers soon became legal and is still a standard course for most art students today. Raffaello di Sanzio. Raphael originally trained in Perugia under master artist Perugino. As most artists did as students, Raphael started out copying the work of his teacher. His version of the apocryphal Marriage of the Virgin, which you're seeing on the screen, is virtually identical to Perugino's version. Both of these remind us of the ideal city theme so popular in the early Renaissance. Raphael came to Florence as a young and ambitious painter. At first, he became famous for his Madonna and child paintings. These paintings were sweet and pretty and also reflected Perugino's influence. However, the triangular format of the small Cowper Madonna and other works demonstrate the influence of Leonardo. Raphael became a leading painter of Florence and was soon so well known that he was called to work for the Vatican in Rome. Perhaps the most important commission from Pope Julius II was for the 4 paintings in the Stanza della Signatura. You can see a view of 2 walls on the screen. The paintings were to represent the 4 main areas of knowledge according to the times: theology, philosophy, jurisprudence, and poetry. In tying the areas of learning to the Catholic Church, Raphael and other artists put Catholic-friendly humanism into practice. The most influential of these paintings, stylistically, is philosophy, which is on the right. This is also known as the School of Athens. You can read an extended explanation of the figures in the composition on page 642. For many people, School of Athens is a quintessentially high Renaissance work. It utilizes ancient architecture, of course reinterpreted for modern times, and perfect linear perspective. The figures are a mix of ancient philosophers, mathematicians, and scientists with modern artists, including portraits of Michelangelo, who was painting the Sistine Chapel ceiling a few dozen feet away at the time, and Raphael himself. You can see here. Some people read this composition as a reworking of Leonardo's Milan Last Supper. You can examine both of them yourself and see if you agree. Raphael had a very prolific and profitable but short career. He fell ill about 15 days before his death at the age of 37. The last work known to be by his hand is the Sistine Madonna, an altarpiece panel made for a Benedictine monastery dedicated to San Sisto. The namesake saint and Santa Barbara admire the Virgin and Christ, while 2 charming angels look longingly from below. Some believe that these little guys were children of the model Raphael used. Others say he saw 2 little boys looking longingly into a bakery on the street one day and painted them into the composition. Whatever their origin, it seems fitting that an artist whose fame originally arose from extraordinarily sweet images of children should have 2 such adorable cherubs in his final work.